as you say, technologies share a number of characteristics. They have learning curves. They get cheaper over time, and they're much more susceptible to exponential growth, particularly when they're small and modular. So when you've got a number of small modular technologies which are easily replicable and can be deployed all over the world, you've got a technology revolution going on, and that's what we see happening here. And I hear all the counter arguments about why it's difficult, can't happen, and so on and so forth. But it cannot really be denied that solar, wind, batteries, and different aspects of electrification have been growing exponentially now for 10 or 20 years. And already now, I guess, is the point of the analysis we've been doing in broad terms, is they're starting to have a very profound impact upon the incumbent system.
Today on Renewable Rides, we are joined by Kingsmill Bond, a veteran financial strategist with over 3 decades of experience at global institutes like Deutsche Bank, Citibank, Rocky Mountain Institute, and now he is at Ember. Kingsmill is helping decode one of the most powerful shifts of our time, the electrotech revolution. We're going to dive into his latest report, Energy Security in an Insecure World, which lays out how clean, electrified energy systems are reshaping global power structures, literally and geopolitically. From fossil fuel disruption to exponential clean tech growth, Kingsmill is going to help us understand not just what's happening, but what it means for business leaders, investors, and nations alike. So let's get into it.
All right, Kingsmill, thank you for joining us. We're super excited to connect with you today and dig in on your report here. Before we do, would love to learn a little bit more about yourself and what are you passionate about?
So, I guess what I'm most interested in is it sounds a bit wonky, but it's the impact of energy systems on history. And from my reading, this is changing energy systems are the primary driver of history. And here we are at an incredible pivot point in the global system where we're transitioning from a fossil-based system to a renewables-based system. And that's going to have incredible implications for many, many areas. So that's what, I guess, somewhat bizarrely, I find quite interesting.
And where did that passion come from, Kingsmill? Give us a bit of a background on who you are, what shaped you.
So I've been working in finance for most of my career. And then before that, I guess I did train as a historian for my sins. So in finance, it's always a question of finding interesting drivers which the market doesn't appreciate. And here in this instance, there's a huge incumbency which is resisting change and seeking to slow down change and actually polluting the debate. And actually, it's a very simple discussion about a technology shift that's going on. And I think for me, the opportunity is just to have a very clean, clear attempt to understand the change in the energy system and think through what it means.
And you find yourself at Ember now. How did you end up at Ember, and what does Ember do?
So Ember is a UK-based think tank looking at the energy transition and is very, very focused on deep data analysis and understanding the change that's happening. So that's how I ended up there.
That's great. And I love that you use a term electrotech. It's actually one that I had never heard of before, and I'm not sure many of our listeners will have done. Can you, before we dig into your report, can you just describe what electrotech is?
Well, electrotech, as you say, is a bit of a neologism, but it's a word which we coined or use in order to describe the fundamental drivers of change to the energy system, which is all around electricity. So it's the production of electricity, which is solar and wind. It's the usage of electricity, which is, for example, EVs and heat pumps and electrification in industry. And then it's also the connections between the supply and the use of electrons, be that through grids or through flexible technologies such as batteries and software and demand side management. And what we thought was quite neat about this framing is it actually draws together a lot of technological innovation that's going on. And it also, not coincidentally, excludes a lot of fake solutions like carbon capture and biomass and all these other boondoggles which the incumbents are trying to push.
Yeah, I love it. I actually really enjoyed the definition, and I really appreciate it.
I also think it's worth noting, and I'm sure you guys, when you were coming up with the term, if you will, that none of those are describing a fuel, right? Your solar, the sun is the fuel, the wind, the sun is technically the fuel that drives the wind, but they're all technologies, which is a very key distinction because of the ability to drive down costs, get to scale. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. I think, this for us again is the key reason why the debate is so clear is because it's basically a technology versus a commodity. And as you say, technologies share a number of characteristics. They have learning curves. They get cheaper over time, and they're much more susceptible to exponential growth, particularly when they're small and modular. So when you've got a number of small modular technologies which are easily replicable and can be deployed all over the world, you've got a technology revolution going on, and that's what we see happening here. And I hear all the counter arguments about why it's difficult, can't happen, and so on and so forth. But it cannot really be denied that solar, wind, batteries, and different aspects of electrification have been growing exponentially now for 10 or 20 years. And already now, I guess, is the point of the analysis we've been doing in broad terms, is they're starting to have a very profound impact upon the incumbent system.
Yeah. Oh, and I think the same could be held true of 20, maybe 30 years ago, of people thinking that all of us would be walking around with high-powered computers in our pockets. I mean, there was a lot of deniers back then, and look at where we are now.
Yeah. And again, here the key is to focus on the new, not the current system. So a lot of the thinking which has been, which has pervaded the debate, has been people saying, "Oh, it's really hard to do this and it's hard to do that," and that's just not how technologies work. I mean, of course, all new technologies are difficult. Look at fridges or tractors, or even the building of roads back in the day. And nothing is easy. But when you've got something which is better and cheaper and local, and lots of clever people can innovate around it and come up with better solutions, you better watch out, because it's going to change the world.
Yeah. Love that. Well, energy security in an insecure world. What prompted you to dig in on the security topic, Kingsmill?
Yeah, so after all these grand statements, we actually looked at something completely different to this technology revolution, which is energy security. And the point is that, like you folks, for most of my career, I have and had just assumed that fossil fuels would be available at a reasonable price, and therefore dependency upon imported fossil fuels was not an especial risk. That's been, I think, baked into the system, and that's what's led behind, that's what stands behind a 12-fold increase since 1960 in fossil fuel imports. That's why the world as a whole, has felt fairly relaxed about getting to a situation where 37% of primary energy demand is imported. And then suddenly, the United States, under its new leadership, how do I put this politely, pivots from facilitator to predator. And you only have to look at the videos of Zelensky, or the Japanese or Korean or UK or everyone else, leaders beating a path to Trump's door, and suddenly realize that if you've been relying upon importing fossil fuels on American-controlled sea lanes, suddenly you need to think again. Will that continue to be available? Will it be weaponized against you? Will it be closed down? Will the Houthis be allowed to take precedence over Europe? All this kind of stuff. So suddenly, I think in the last 2 months, all of us have woken up to the fact that the assumptions which we have been brought up with and using for the last decades are actually being called into question. And then you take a long, hard look at the energy system, and you see, as I say, that over a third of primary energy demand is currently imported fossil fuels. And the big problem with fossil fuels, which is different to almost everything else that we use, is that if you don't get them, you can't have this call. Your electricity, your lights go out, and your industry grinds to a halt, and you can't drive anywhere because you buy this stuff. You can store a few weeks of it, but you can't store years worth of fossil fuels because they're so incredibly heavy. And so it's a real problem for countries now, and I think they really need to wake up to the security dimensions of being dependent upon so much fossil fuel imports. Just to give you a few other observations. So it's over a third for the world as a whole, but of course there are individual regions and countries where it's far more than that. So in Europe, for example, it's half of our primary energy demand. In Spain and Italy, it's 75% of primary energy demand is imported fossil fuels. In Morocco, it's 90%. And then, of course, you've got the whole of the global south where fossil fuel dependency is only rising over time. So India's about 1/3 now, but that's clearly going to rise under any kind of business as usual scenario over time. So, yeah, it's a problem now for now 3/4 of the world lives in fossil fuel importers.
So Kingsmill, if I'm a skeptical listener, I think, okay, great argument. You were talking now about producing wind and solar, but most of the solar panels, batteries in EVs are all coming out of are all imported. Yet your report highlights that the new dependencies are not comparable to the old. Maybe you can spend a couple minutes talking about the differences between the oil and gas supply chain and some of these newer electro technologies.
Sure. So just to be clear, the solution, or a solution, relatively easy solution, is the electrotech solution, which is to say you deploy solar and wind for your electricity system, and then you electrify stuff for your end use sectors, specifically transportation, and that will reduce your imports, we calculated, by about 70%. So there is a proper solution, the electrotech solution. And to answer your question, Dan, what's the difference between a solar panel and a lump of coal is that a solar panel lasts for 30 years and a lump of coal lasts for the 1 minute you burn it. And therefore, if your supplier cuts off the coal, then you can't burn it anymore, or the oil or the gas, you can't burn it anymore, you can't get the energy. If they cut off the supply of solar panels, you still got 30 years to figure out a solution. So that really is the big difference. And you could do various other cute pieces of analysis. The IEA showed us that a shipload of solar panels would replace 30 shiploads of gas. Or to put it in other terms, if you spend $1 million on buying solar panels, you would roughly have to spend $1 million on gas, but every single year. Mm. So it's a really big difference in dependency. And of course, if you've got this kind of very long lead time, if China decides to shut off solar panel exports to you, well, as I say, you've got 30 years to find out a solution. I mean, you go, you either do it yourself, or you go to India, or you send in your, industrial spies, and you work out how to do it. I mean, it's not impossible. But of course, if Saudi Arabia closes off oil exports, as Europe and US found to their cost in 1973, lines form at the gas station within days. So it's just completely different degree of dependency between the two systems.
Yeah. And I really like that you frame it not only from a perspective of what you just described there, Kingsmill, of supply chain, but also just the duration it takes to install these projects. And I liked your graphic around natural gas and LNG import, and it's like a 5 to 10 year process of getting all the infrastructure in place versus, a solar plus battery behind the meter solution as an example.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's again. So we're hearing a lot at the moment about how important it is to get energy to data centers.
Yeah.
So if you're fortunate enough to have a data center which sits next to an existing, power plant which sits next to a gas field, then fine, great. But most people are not in that happy position. Most people have to build the pipelines and the connections and the power stations, and this takes years or even decades to do. So, and of course the difference is, if you've got a solar panel, you just stick it up in a field on a weekend. I mean, and then you have to build a grid connection in for solar, same way as you do for coal or gas. And that can take longer. But again, for most people, it's so much faster to deploy solar and wind at scale.
So Kingsmill, you referenced the new U.S. administration, and within that they focused on, and I'll quote, unleashing American energy, and a big part of that is energy independence. However, you guys found that U.S. is largely energy independent, at least from the findings of the report. Can you expand upon a little bit of the U.S. specifics that you found in the report?
Sure. I mean, good for America, because America has unleashed its energy. But the key point is that it did it 25 years ago. If you take the peak of U.S. fossil fuel imports, it's about 2002. It peaks at 33% of U.S. demand is coming from imported fossil fuels, and then basically people discover shale, and over the next 2 decades, as everyone knows, the US has gone from really very quickly from being a very major importer to being an exporter. You kind of crosses the line in 2019. The point, I suppose, is that for the rest of the world, for the 95% of people who live in other countries apart from the United States, the fact that the world's hegemon has moved from being energy importer to an energy exporter just makes the situation much more vulnerable, because when the US was an importer, it too was subject to the economics of imports. It's just very dangerous. When you're an exporter, you can't export for a few months. It doesn't really matter. It's not a big problem, and you can start to blackmail the people who want to buy stuff from you, and demand special favors from them. So it's just very, very it's very different for the US. And the problem is that other countries do not have the same capacity as the US does. I mean, there are a few countries, Guyana, for example, tiny countries, few million people, that can do something similar. But India or China, in spite of trying very, very hard, has not been able to unleash the same amount of domestic energy, particularly oil and gas, as the US has done. So it's just it's very different for the rest of the world. And actually, the success of the US actually makes the rest of the world more vulnerable in a strange way.
Mm. Who do you find is most vulnerable in terms of your analysis?
Well, the standout area of vulnerability is Korea and Japan. We basically have almost no fossil fuels. You're talking about 80% of primary energy demand is imported fossil fuels, and the next highest level of dependency is Europe. As I say, about 50% as a total, but there are plenty of countries where it's 3/4 of primary energy demand. And then I think it's also worthwhile noting that, again, contrary to popular belief, most people in Africa live in energy importers. 2/3 of people in Africa live in energy importers. There is this wonderful fossil fuel argument that you've got to allow the good folks in Africa to sell fossil fuels, but actually what they forget is that most people, even in Africa, we're very, very low levels of energy demand right now, already importing fossil fuels. So this is a universal problem right across the world that people are subject to increasingly predatory fossil fuel exporters.
And on the flip side, you say renewables, solar and wind potential is 100x energy demand today and 120x fossil fuel production. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah. So this is the point. I mean, you just do some very simple analysis, which we take data from NREL and Largest and Mark Jacobson, and you add up for every country in the world, what is their renewable energy potential? How much energy could they get from solar and wind? And of course, we are deliberately incredibly conservative. You can't put. We assume you couldn't put solar and wind on farmland or forest and cities and so on and so forth, and nature reserves. So it's fairly conservative, and even then, you have vast amounts of renewable energy potential which can get unleashed. So as you say, it's about 100 times as much as current global energy demand, is 120 times as much as fossil fuels currently are supplying. So for most countries right across the world, if you need to get energy security quick, and you look out the window, what can you do? You can either dig holes and hope for the best, where you failed thus far to find enough fossil fuels, or you just get on the phone to your Chinese supplier, put some solar panels up, and suddenly you start reducing your energy dependency. So it's pretty clear to us where most of the world is going to go. Now, of course, you do have 25% of the world which is fossil fuel exporters today, and we're not suggesting that everyone's going to go down this path, but enough people will, and particularly Europe, China, India, Northeast Asia, and in fact Asia as a whole, are going to go down this path of electrotech solutions, because they've got lots of solar, lots of wind, and lots of electrification potential.
Kingsmill, I'm wondering if there's a parallel to be drawn as some of these countries that you mentioned, because of the local nature, particularly of solar, but wind somewhat as well, but definitely solar. Do you think there's a scenario in which it kind of leapfrogs the massive growth of the centralized electric infrastructure and drives more of a local? And what I mean by that is I think about African countries that, from a communications perspective, really just went straight into like mobile and heavy like mobile payments in particular, and because of the distributed nature of that. Do you think that that's going to be the case here because of the local nature of being able to produce electrons and consume them?
Yeah, I mean, this is the glory of this technology. It's local and distributed, and everyone, at least everyone with a decent government and everyone who can get hold of the solar panels, can just deploy these technologies. And I think, again, you cannot overstate the degree to which this is happening already. So from our calculations, not in this piece, but in a separate piece, already 20% of the global south has leapfrogged the US in terms of solar and wind as a share of electricity generation. And a further 20%, or a separate 20%, has also leapfrogged the US and Europe in terms of electrification. Electricity is a share of final energy consumption. And in fact, 2022 is the year when Asia overtook Europe and the US in terms of electrification. So yeah, this is another leapfrog in our midst. And, and yet I have all these people who say to me, you can't use the leapfrog word, and I'm like, well, why not? It's happening.
Yeah. And what made me think of it was we're seeing it happen like in real time in Pakistan. And yeah. I knew that the numbers were big, and I was just doing a quick research while we were chatting, and looked like in 2024, they imported 17 gigawatts. According to actually an Ember report, Global Electricity Review 2025, they imported 17 gigawatts of solar panels. And so we're seeing this actually play out in real time, where the numbers that we're seeing of the deployment of solar in Pakistan are blowing any predictions out of the water.
Yeah, and again, if you go back to the sort of the framing of the barriers to change 2 or 3 years ago, people said there's not enough money to deploy these technologies because they were thinking that it cost the same in the rest of the world as it does in Kansas, but it doesn't. There are no tariffs. You just buy the Chinese stuff direct. It's a third of the price that they're selling to they're selling for the United States. Local labor is much cheaper. You just lay it on the ground. And it is not just Pakistan. We're starting to see this happening across Africa. We're starting to see it happen, in Southeast Asia. Balcony solar in Germany. I mean, this just is a phenomenon everywhere where people want cheap, local, controllable energy. They're putting it into place.
In Kingsmill, what would you say to? We just saw the major outage in Spain and France. Do you have any perspectives on the kind of naysayers who will say that's renewables driven and we're at risk if we don't continue to have fossils on the grid and that spinning inertia?
Yeah, I mean, look, this is, well, first of all, as we all know, at time of recording, we don't yet know in detail the reason why this happened. But let us not forget that we have had grid outages for decades. It's not something that's specific to renewables-based systems. Furthermore, there are many renewables-based systems in northern Germany, for example, or South Australia or Ireland, which have higher levels of deployment of solar and wind than they do in Spain and Portugal. So even should it turn out to be related to the renewable-based system, what are we meant to do as human beings? Either we just say we hit a brick wall, we're giving up, or we just say we hit a speed bump, let's figure it out.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's the key point. We have consistently for over a century figured out how to deploy electricity to more and more sectors. And go back to the 1880s and the famous Pearl Street station in New York. I mean, it was so bad, the production of electricity from coal at the time, that they had to have engineers on time, full time, because the machines broke down every 2 or 3 hours. I mean, it's not as if we haven't crossed many barriers for many years. And sorry, the final point I'll make is that this kind of argument that we hear from the fossil fuel folks, that it's all the fault of renewables. Renewables have a certain limit which they cannot exceed in the electricity grid. I mean, we've been hearing this for 20 years, folks.
Yeah.
Back in 2000, it was thought to be 5%, and very, very worthy, clever documents were written by the people running the Irish and German grids saying, it could never be more than 5%. Well, here we are, 20 years later, and some regions already aspiring to 100%. So, at the very worst, this is a speed bump. And what's much more likely is that, as the Spanish Prime Minister has been saying, we're going to sort this one out, and we are going to figure out why it happened, and we will solve the problem. A very large part of the problem, for what it's worth, is you want to be putting more batteries right across your grid. So again, as you've seen, the last 2 or 3 years, I mean, the number of stationary storage batteries has just been literally doubling every single year. So in 2024, as I recall, we installed as much in 24 as we had installed in all of history into stationary storage. So don't underestimate this. Final point to make on this one is take a look what's happening in China. They want to incorporate their electric vehicle fleet into the grid, and they have a capacity to do that. Can you imagine? That's almost a 10x increase in the potential for storage from batteries. With a few strokes of a pen, it's incredible what can be done. Yeah,
we're actually seeing it play out in real time here in California as well. I was just looking to verify, and it looks like we've hit 58 straight and 99 out of the 131 days so far this year, where the supply for a period of time, and typically several hours on average, for a little over 4 hours a day, has come purely 100% from wind, water, and solar. Now, California is a bit of a microcosm, but I think it's showing that it can work.
Yeah, well, California, as we all know, California is not just a microcosm; it's also a leader. Same thing as in Eastern China, same thing in Northern Europe. We did this quite an interesting analysis comparing, different regions within countries, and you want to see the future of energy. You start looking at those 3 regions, and you get a very clear sense.
Yeah. Well, so zooming in on the U.S., you in the report, in the graphic that talked about like the rise of U.S. oil imports, and then to your point, back in 2002, kind of where it peaked and started to come down, and now we're as of 2019 an exporter. In that graph, there was a question that you left the readers to say, is there a new energy age? What is your prediction? What are you seeing of U.S. and kind of how we're going to evolve in the coming decade or so?
Yeah, look, I think a lot of people are talking about a new geopolitical framework, especially in Europe, and that not coincidentally goes along with a new energy framing where instead of assuming that fossil fuels will always be available, it's just a much more uncertain era, and one where governments not necessarily immediately but governments over time are going to have to figure out how to get more homegrown energy and be less subject to these external pressures. So I think it is much more, and as many people are saying here, not original in any way, it's much more an age of anxiety or uncertainty, where people will need homegrown solutions.
And as you know, Kingsmill, we primarily focus on commercial industrial businesses, and we're seeing the rise of robotics, the rise of AI, the rise of electrification of equipment, of fleets. What would be your call to action or advice to business leaders who are seeing the macro trends and starting to think about their own day-to-day operations?
Well, I'm always a little bit nervous about this idea of call to action because it makes it sound like a moral debate. This is not a moral debate. This is an absolutely tooth and claw attempt to survive in a different world that's coming, and that is a world where gradually and then quickly every single end-use sector is going to be electrified. So actually, it's very interesting at the moment. Only, it's a slightly misleading way of calculating, but if you take the IEA statistics, only 20% of final energy demand is currently electrified. So that means, therefore, there's everything else which is increasingly going to be electrified. You don't want to find yourself in the same position as the US and European car sector, which is in denial and trying to slow down change, and they just let the Chinese eat their lunch in the car sector. And that's going to happen right across the board in every other sector. Take a look at what's happening in the electrification of the Chinese industrial sector. It's just a straight line increase every single year, 1 percentage point increase, which doesn't sound like much, but it's 10 percentage points a decade. Over 2 decades, suddenly you leapfrogged Europe and the United States. And you're figuring out how to electrify your light industrial sector and the medium temperature heat and so on and so forth. And the people who do this will be leading the businesses of the future. I mean, it's kind of very, very obvious. So it just seems to me that the starting gun has now been fired for the electrification of end use. And it's not for, as I say, not for moral reasons, very, very practical reasons, that this stuff is much more efficient and local. And if you can get cheap electricity, possibly back onto that. But if you can get cheap electricity, then suddenly you can outcompete your slower competitors who are still, pouring in imported LNG into their systems. They haven't got a chance.
This isn't something that China implemented in 2024. They've been working at this for a while to get to their position today. Do you think the primary driver was due to them being an oil and gas importer, or was it seeing the tea leaves on kind of the global energy landscape and being able to become an exporter of this electrotech, or a combination?
There is the famous book, The Innovator's Dilemma, which basically says that incumbents always struggle to change because it's the current system's so nice for them, and therefore it's insurgents who drive change. So in this, the energy system, China was a laggard and is an insurgent, and figured out other ways to do stuff. And some people, it'll be for historians to judge whether or not there was some brilliant master plan. I think it's more likely, from talking to my friends in China, that it was just a question of they went down this path, they allocated capital to see if it would work. It started to work. It worked better and better, and then the rest is history. So I think it was a very fortunate series of capital allocation decisions made at a central governmental level, which they were able to double down on and exploit. And the point to me is, a lot of people are saying, well, China's won the race. China hasn't won the race. China is leading in the race. Everyone else, there are 8,000 million of us in the world. There's a lot of talent everywhere. And, from French cables to American software, to German machinery, or Korean know-how, everyone can contribute because, as I say, it is a kind of race of technology versus commodities. And there's just so much scope for innovation right across the world.
I want to jump in, and Gareth, I know you had something, but you just blew my mind at connecting. I've spent my entire career in kind of high growth startup, mostly software companies. And so the innovator's dilemma is a very real thing, and the incumbents resisting change. I had never put that together on the more geopolitical scale, and we're seeing it right now where America's kind of trying to dig its heels in and say, no, let's keep with the old versus versus really adopting the new. And so I appreciate that framing, because it helps me a lot.
Well, look, I mean, the great thing about the United States is that it has an incredible capacity for reinvention. So there may be a short period where at a federal level change is resisted, but I'm absolutely confident that the US will revert to its standard position of challenging for leadership, in this space, over time. I mean, the risk is if it doesn't, and I think it will, but if it doesn't, then it becomes a little bit like China after 1800, where the big energy technology revolution of the era was fossil fuels, and China was unable to figure it out, double down on its biomass-based system, and as a result, faced a terrible century of, as they call it, of humiliation. So, it's important for other countries to get with the new energy system, lest they fall too far behind and find themselves totally subject to foreign imports.
And there are obviously implications of China owning the supply chain today, from a mineral processing perspective to producing the equipment. I think in terms of your analysis before, talking about if you can't import solar panels, it impacts your ability to do projects now, but all historic projects will continue to operate for 30 years. What are the implications you see of China leading the way right now, and what should we be doing about it?
So, I mean, the first implication of China leading the way is very simple. You can buy cheap stuff.
Yeah.
Buy a solar panel at 9 cents. 9 cents of what? Great, thanks very much. I could buy a battery at under $100. I'll take that. Just in very simple terms, and that observation, I suspect, applies to most countries. Of course, there are other countries, India, United States, above all, I guess, who do have a strategic necessity to figure out a solution. And the answer surely is, well, you're going to need some homegrown solutions, and you just got to get on with it and do it. And that's what Biden's team was doing until a few months ago. And that's what the Indian government's now doing. They're trying to build up their own competition. And it is quite important because, I mean, at the end of the day, everyone needs a certain amount of competition. But there are clever ways of doing this and dumb ways of doing it. The dumb way is to put on massive tariffs and keep the Chinese stuff out. The clever way is to do exactly what China did 20 years ago and encourage your competitors to come and set up in your own country and learn from them and then do it better. And that's what, I think Europe will now do. We'll encourage Chinese companies to come in and set up battery factories and figure out how to do it and work with them, and hopefully we'll find us some niches to do ourselves. But we don't need a kind of knee-jerk reaction to keep China out. We just got to, as with any technology, you just want to use it, embrace it, and get on with it.
I find it super interesting how when the Inflation Reduction Act came out, everyone was nervous about the US sucking up manufacturing, human capital, all the brilliant thought leaders of the world, because it was a commercially driven initiative of, the most commercial driven outcomes win. And now we're seeing the likes of Europe come in hunting for US talent on the back of the tariff discussion. I think you're absolutely right.
But I say, this is a marathon, not a sprint. Yeah. It's going to place over decades. You have individual administrations that come and they go, and they can try and take the US or indeed other countries. North Korea springs to mind. Back to happy halcyon days of former dominance in the old energy technology. It's just not going to work. And where this will all come out, incidentally, and this is, I suppose, the key point and probably relevant to your listeners, is in price. Because if we're right, and it's a question of technology versus commodities, it will eventually come out in price. It'll come out in the price of electricity, which for me is the most important number in the energy transition. So if you run a good system with intelligently run policy, which is working night and day to reduce electricity prices and avoiding the various boondoggles which surround that industry, then you will get low prices to your customers, low prices to your voters. Voters will keep you in, and industries will stick around. If you don't, then you find yourself at enormous risk. So again, this is where I think it's worthwhile having a very hard-nosed financial approach to this debate. We in Europe have got to stop, if I may say so, focusing quite so much on wonderful 2050 carbon capture solutions and much more on getting the flipping price down tomorrow.
Yeah.
which actually requires, instead of wonderful COP speeches, it requires hard work.
Yeah.
Of changing regulatory regimes and opening up, prizing open systems to allow these new technologies to come in.
The other thing I appreciate about the report, and you're kind of touching on it there, of the technologies needed for this, they already exist. We're not asking for a technological revolution. Like they're out there. It's just getting them deployed faster, quicker to help drive down the prices of the equipment itself, but also the electricity that's produced by these technologies.
Yeah, I mean, from our calculations, if you split the energy system into two parts, electricity generation and then end use. So from our calculation, something like 70% of electricity generation is amenable to having solar and wind deployed at lower costs than the current system. And about 2/3 of end use is in the same position. So all of light transportation, most home heating, and low temperature industrial heat adds up to about 2/3 of end use. So you basically got 2/3 of the system, which is being challenged by cheaper electrotech solutions. And the point is, at the moment, it's only 20% is coming from non-fossil solutions. At a primary level, actually, it's 40% in electricity. It's about 40% also in end-use solutions, so because of the bizarre way that the maths is done in this system. But anyway, the point, nevertheless, is that we have an enormous ceiling of opportunity to deploy these technologies, and that's what we need to be focusing on right now. And I think that the debate has often been held in terms of, well, how do I solve the last the last 10% of electricity, or how do I solve flying or petchem? These are end game solutions. It's the same thing when you had transition from horses to cars in after 1900. It took a long time to figure out how to do lorries, but we got there, and it's going to be similar now. There'll be residual areas of fossil fuel demand, but that's what, 20% of the system. Good luck surviving off that, because it's just, you're going to get it disrupted long before you get to the last 20%.
Yeah. To close out a summary of the report, Kingsmill, do you want to just share the way you speak about the clouds are gathering, the weather's coming? Do you want to kind of ride through the storm or sail away from it? What are the kind of the big levers that countries, economies should be considering, planning, implementing to stay ahead of the storm?
Sure. These are two metaphors for my very brilliant co-authors, Sam Butler-Schloss and Dan Walter. The world is clearly changing, and the old solution to this problem was to figure out other ways to other suppliers of fossil fuels, and maybe do some efficiency work, and really hope for the best. And now we have a new suite of solutions. You can deploy electrotech. You can decarbonize your electricity generation. You can electrify your end uses, and you can, of course, do efficiency. And I think it's just people need a new suite of solutions actually for a new world.
Cool. Would love to shift to close out with our power surge round. And Kingsmill, we'll start with one of our favorite questions. If you could be any one energy technology, what would it be and why?
Well, I'm sorry to be so exceptionally obvious, but it would have to be a solar panel.
Nice.
Because it's just so wonderfully efficient at getting energy, and it works every single day. The sun rises every morning, even in England.
Yeah, I do appreciate that from the report. We had one of our customers, a biotechnology business owner, that had a quote that said, "The sun seems like a pretty reliable partner. I'm going to bet on the sun."
Yeah, think about plants. Plants manage to get away without giant resources. And they just sit there and get the sunshine. Anyway, sorry, it's getting beyond my pay grade, but yeah.
That's great. It sounds like you're very anti-carbon capture. Do you want to just expand on that, or your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, to any of your listeners who are in the carbon capture space, guys, it's over. It's over. It was always fake. And now, it's just finished. I'm sorry to say. This is an expensive solution which was designed by the fossil fuel sector to resist and slow down change. And now they don't even need to bother. So, it's kind of we need real solutions, not solutions which add to the relatively high costs of the fossil fuel system. So it was fun while it lasted, folks, but I think it's finished.
Super interesting. And you're obviously super well read. Do you have any recommendations for your favorite sources of information, whether that be books, podcasts, newsletters?
So, I've got to start with my friend, Chris Nelder, and the energy transition. A big shout out for him. Very interesting analysis. And then, in terms of books, I think I'm a very sad person. I love reading energy textbooks. Jonathan Coomey, your own Mark Jacobson in California.
Yeah.
Great analysis. And then you've got to have a big shout out to Hannah Ritchie, Our World in Data. I mean, crikey, what incredible data she does. So, and she also got a recent book. So, big fans of all their work.
I should have given Mark the shout out that he deserved when I referenced the streak of wind, water, solar days here in California. That was his analysis.
Yeah, I mean, his stuff has been great, and we use his data. So very impressive.
Kingsmill, this has been awesome. Such a pleasure to have you on. Any closing comments or thoughts or anything we failed to capture?
No, it's just, it's a changing world, folks. And thanks for the opportunity.
We appreciate you. Keep up the great work. The analysis is super powerful, and we'll definitely make sure all our listeners check it out.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
Thanks, Kingsmill. All right, Gareth. That was an action-packed session. And first, I really appreciated, I feel like there's very few people out there with a history background, history and economics background, focusing on the energy transition. Maybe there's more out there that I've not met, but I think that's such a valuable perspective when looking at the future, is to understand kind of where we've come from and largely driven around the economics of it.
Yeah. I love just cutting through the naysayers and the misinformation, just getting to the facts and figures and presenting it as it is. I think the big takeaway for me is, we can reduce net fossil imports by 70% with 3 levers: more renewables, more heat pumps, more EVs, and 3 technologies that are all available today, all completely accessible, all proven out, all well deployed. And we just need to deploy more of it, and we can really help minimize the security impacts for both economies and businesses. And I think the big issue that he kept bringing to the forefront is, trade and supply chains are no longer certain. And that's because the macro environment is completely changing. And so if we want to rely on those and put our heads in the sand, we're at risk of finding ourselves in the thick of a storm that we can't really get out of.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think for me that what really jumped out is in the report they highlighted that 52 countries import more than half of their primary energy as fossil fuels, and that 74% of the global population lives in nations that are dependent on foreign supplies of fossil fuels. Yet, when we think about businesses, 97% of commercial industrial buildings out there are 100% importers of electricity or of energy, meaning they solely rely on the centralized grid infrastructure, whether that be the electric grid, which is a huge portion of it, or even the gas infrastructure. And so when we think about deploying electrotech, electrifying our equipment, electrifying our fleet, we're now relying on a resource that we can produce locally. We can reduce at the facility. Yeah. And you hear me talk about that, where a beer company is not going to all of a sudden put up an aluminum smelter at their facility to produce their own cans. It's just not tenable. But you can produce your own electrons and feed them right into your processes. And I think that that's really the big advantage here from both a security perspective, but also a cost perspective.
Yeah, love it. Couldn't agree more. I think, as we keep saying, control the controllables, and energy is certainly one of them.
That's it. All right. Cheers, Kev.
All right. Cheers.
We receive a lot of questions from business leaders around the world wanting to learn more about the energy transition, what is possible, and where to start. So to help you stay informed and up to date on best practices, opportunities, risks, and success stories, we created an industry newsfeed at VECKTA.com/news with all our podcasts, blogs, and newsletter. Check it out and connect with Dan, myself, and the VECKTA team to learn more. Cheers and have a good one.